from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord. This weekend we have the Gospel of Jesus' teaching on the two great commandments. And so this is from Matthew 22, 34 through 40. We have to go back to the Torah, or begin with the Torah. What's the Torah? That's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Bible. Can you name them? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, but Numbers then Deuteronomy, technically. So also known as the Pentateuch. So the Torah, those first 5 books, they, according to the Pharisees, they contain 613 commandments. 613 commandments. There are commandments that are considered to be positive, in that they say, "Thou shalt," and there are commandments that are considered to be negative, and they say, "Thou shalt not." There are 365 "thou shalt not" or negative commandments, and there are 248 positive or "thou shalt" commandments. And of course, this simple fact gave rise to this widely debated question among the rabbis: which is the greatest? Which is the greatest commandment of all of these 613? Now, although all of the precepts of the law were considered of equal significance, the rabbis would still gather to discuss how to summarize so many commandments into a memorable few. And so this scholar who is testing Jesus, he asked this question, well, which is the greatest? What do you think, in other words? And so then Jesus answers this scholar quoting from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. It is the opening of what is known as the Shema. The Shema is the fundamental creed of Judaism, and of course it is the first commandment paraphrased, if you will. So to put God first in our lives, having nothing before him in his service, it's the greatest commandment because it's the most important. Placing God as our first priority in life means I do everything for God, and all my thoughts, my words, and actions are motivated by service of him. And this is what it means to truly love God with whole heart, soul, and mind. These words of heart, soul, and mind in reference to love is a reference to a kind of love that involves and commits the whole person. This kind of love involving heart, soul, and mind dominates our emotions, directs our thoughts, and is or should be the motivating force behind all of our actions. This kind of love involves the whole person who is committed and fully engaged, and is also the kind of love that truly fulfills and satisfies us. When we look at love, of course, we look at relationships, we might wonder why they are not always satisfying. Well, because probably one or both persons are not fully committed or fully engaged with heart, mind, and soul, as the Lord is teaching today. Of course, we all fail at this commandment, right? No one can really truly be, at least not without God's grace. I mean, it's difficult to be fully committed, heart, mind, and soul. Every thought is motivated by love of God. That's a difficult task, but nonetheless, the Lord Jesus gives us this today because it is the most important, and because that is where all of our happiness actually comes from. If I spend my life pleasing God, I will be able to be happy. It is a love that is the successful, faithful, joyful, forgiving, playful, affectionate, and loyal. And so according to Jesus' own words, this is the kind of love of ours that ought to be directed toward God first before anything or anyone else. All right, so therefore this greatest commandment is to love God with your whole heart, soul, and mind, so that everything we do is for God. And of course, then Jesus goes a step further. He gives a second greatest commandment. The second greatest commandment is of equal importance. It's to love your neighbor as yourself, which, of course, if we go to Leviticus 19:18, we're going to find that neighbor meant fellow Israelite. So they don't have to love anyone other than fellow Israelites, because those were considered neighbors. The definition of neighbor to mean fellow Israelite comes from their understanding of love as belonging or loyalty. If we've never really thought about what love means, how we would define it, we have to spend some time trying to understand that. What does it really mean to love God? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to me to love? What does God mean by love? And so, but for them, for the Israelites, love was belonging or loyalty. Belonging or loyalty specifically to a group of neighbors, if you will. So in their understanding, belonging or loyalty to a family, then a village, then a neighborhood, and then a faction. What's a faction? It's a specific group, like the 12 is a faction. The Pharisees is a faction. All right, and so those are the loyalty or the love towards a group that they should have. Family, village, neighborhood, faction, in that order. But Jesus, of course, has extended the meaning of neighbor to what? To or who? To anyone in need. That's who our neighbor truly is. From a Christian perspective, the neighbor is anyone in need, especially anyone whom God puts in front of us in need. So loving anyone in need as ourselves means extending to others the same kind of personal concern we have for ourselves. It also means that we treat others the way I would like to be treated, or going beyond that, even treating others better than they deserve. So Jesus, he pairs these two commandments together as the greatest of all commandments to reveal how much we love God, as they are related. So there's a revelation in how much I actually love God. How do you know you love God? Right? That's the question, isn't it? How do I know I love God? Am I loving God the way I should? Do I love at all? All right? It's the first basic question, right? So the proof that I love God is in how much I love my neighbor. All right? Especially my annoying, irritating, bothersome neighbors. Okay? How much I love them, right? Okay, it's easy to love a God whom we cannot see. But to love an irritating neighbor whom we can see reveals something about our love for God. At times, God permits annoying, irritating, or bothersome people in our lives specifically for the reason to reveal to us how good or not so good we are doing on loving Him. And so if we were to love God with our whole heart, soul, and mind, then we would find loving our neighbor comes quite easily. All right. Loving our neighbor means we want their ultimate good, which is for them to go to heaven. It doesn't mean we have to be friends with everybody. Jesus, he loved the Pharisees, but he wasn't friends with them. He still wanted the Pharisees to go to heaven, even though they crucified him or led to his crucifixion. So loving our neighbor means we want their ultimate good, which is for them to go to heaven. We want even our enemies to go to heaven. Even our enemies who are in need become our neighbor, whom we are also called to love. This is, of course, a high calling, a difficult calling, and without the Lord's grace, we would be lost. So in the end, Jesus does not discard the other commandments, but rather explicitly adds, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. All right, so we don't have to worry about mistreating widows and orphans so that God's wrath will flare up and kill us with a sword. We don't have to worry about that if we are loving God. Then we'll automatically go towards loving our neighbor. It happens. So therefore, all the other precepts and instructions in the Old Testament, as well as all the church's doctrine and teachings, are simply ways in which these two fundamental principles of love God and love neighbor find their expression. All right, you only have to remember those two. Technically, love God and love neighbor. But there's a lot more to that, which is why all these other teachings are given to us in the church, so that for our little finite minds, if you will, compared to God's infinite mind, we can come to understand what he truly means by these commands, to love God, to love neighbor. And so then we need all this extra teaching, this extra guidance, this extra direction all this other teachings, these volumes of works throughout the centuries to help us understand simply how to love God and love neighbor. So our response to these two commandments determines our ability to experience love, to be loved, and to give ourselves in love. And so to live our lives loving God and loving our neighbor, it means that we live fulfilled lives of happiness. And so then, simply put, loving God is the source of our own love for others. After all, God is love, right? If God is love, what's that make us? Am I love? Are you love? Well, no, because we're not God, but God dwells within us, right? God dwells within us, then it's his love that we recognize in one another. All right, that's what I tell married couples at their weddings when they're marrying them, is I go, the only reason you two like each other is because it's God's love that you see in the other. Because God has graced us, he has given us his life, it is his love that we recognize in others, which attracts us to other people. Because God's love is dwelling in us. So the reason then Jesus goes further to answer the scholar's question, beyond the greatest commandment, he adds the second, is to show the dependence of the second commandment upon the first. What's that mean? Our ability to love, where does our ability to love come from? Our ability to love God, it does not come from us, it comes from God. Okay, we're not the source of our ability to love. God is, because God is love. God is love, that's where it comes from. He's the source of our love. He's a source of love. And so when I love God first, then I learn how to love my spouse, my friends, my children, my cousins, and any other neighbor, including my enemies, at all. And so no one can love your neighbor as yourself without loving God first. That's how we know. Well, that's how we start to understand, and that's how we start to actually live out love of neighbor. All right, so if we strive to love God more and more, then we will find loving our spouses, our children, our family, our fellow human beings, and even those considered to be our enemies much easier. It's almost as if, if I were to teach this, you could almost say, but I'm careful to not say it, but I'm going to say it anyway, is stop trying to love your neighbor so much and work on pleasing God more. We try to go at the result, if you will. The result is inevitably we want to love our neighbor, right? Okay, but we keep trying to love our neighbor. It's like loving neighbor is like a side effect of being in love with God. Okay, if I keep striving to please God, the loving neighbor thing is going to be automatic, if you will, a consequence. And so that is why we have to keep going back to God. If I keep trying to love God first with my whole heart, my whole mind, and my whole soul, all right, then that whole loving neighbor thing, the irritating, bothersome, opposite political party person, okay, that's all going to be easy. Can you imagine a world where Democrats and Republicans get along and love each other?